Today, we're going to talk about how to use melee influence, but more specifically, where I use melee influence as someone who uses more than 80% of the melee weapons in the game. I know a lot of people would just say use it on everything because it's so OP, but I just can't do that. I'll explain this more in another video, but the main thing is that if I sort my gear by usage, it allows me to randomize everything and basically force myself to build as many usable weapons as possible, with the melee class being the most absurd example of this. Every weapon you're seeing I've used consistently in the randomizer. But the only important thing for you to understand is that this list has given me a very in-depth understanding of how to judge melee weapons, based primarily on two statistics that define whether or not I use melee influence. The first and by far most important statistic isn't really even a stat. It's the weapon itself, but also their stance, with the secret being that there are 13 melee types in this game with a force slash proc on the heavy attack. But of course, the second stat is just the base crit of the weapon, with the cutoff being a minimum of about 20% crit chance. So if a weapon matches those two criteria, I try not to build it for melee influence because those high damage slash procs are great for single targets. We'll discuss each of those classes more in depth in a bit. For now, let's finally talk about melee influence. Melee influence is an 18-second buff that has a 20% chance of triggering off of an electric status effect. That chance will play a big role in specific builds, but not all of them. When the buff is active, all elemental status effects are spread to enemies within 20 meters, which creates this cascading damage effect that defines why we all love it so much. I only ever use influence with two elemental combos. Obviously, you need electricity as a solo element, so your other double element functions as the DPS. Blast is going to be the better choice just because of how well it synergizes with influence itself and many other builds. But gas has also been very fun to use on specific setups. It is worse, but still works pretty well. My builds are broken up into slam builds and swinging builds. I use slam builds on weapons that don't have any force slash procs on the simpler normal attacks, because I've started to enjoy the safety of only being near enemies for the split second after you slam. Weapons like hammers, fists, polearms, staves, heavy blades, nunchucks, and sparring weapons also have a good heavy slam radius, which matches perfectly. These weapons are defined by their map wipe and room clear abilities. But these builds do have a downside if you're not using something like Archititron. As you can see in the builds I'm showing off, I'm focusing a lot on getting a lot of status chance and electricity damage because the chance to proc influence is much, much worse than a swinging weapon. Any weapon that you swing normally will almost never worry about proccing influence. But being forced to start swinging a slam weapon that isn't built to be swung every 18 seconds kind of defeats the purpose of making a slam build in the first place, because obviously you're then stuck next to enemies just like any other weapon. So the more I prioritized proccing influence, the more usable those weapons became, landing me on the builds you've been seeing so far. But if your squad has the oh-so-beloved Nourish ability, or any of the elemental augment abilities like Venom Dose, you can almost guarantee you'll never proc influence on these slam builds, so take that with a grain of salt. Let's talk about the only situations where I use gas damage. Obviously the magic is that the heavy slam is all blast damage, which is amazing. So on a slam build with low crit, I can maximize the status and have a crazy time by adding gas as my double element, so influence spreads both blast and gas. There are also some weapons with built-in toxin damage that will force you to build for gas so that it doesn't combine with electricity. Now, melee influence builds where I actually swing the weapon can be a little more unique. Obviously, the force slash proc on the normal attack will just add DPS to your existing build, but if you have a weapon like Heat Dagger, which does have a force slash proc on the heavy attack, but has super low crit chance, that's an example of meeting one criteria but not the other, so then it becomes an influence weapon. Another interesting example is Idun, which is a polearm, so it has no force slash procs, but does have a fun heavy attack, so it becomes a classic swinging influence build, where taking advantage of Tennokai really comes in clutch. There are 4 weapon classes that I almost always use this build on: swords, dual swords, sword and shield, and blade and whip. And there are a lot of weapons in some of those categories, so you have some really strong options to choose from. These builds look a little more like what you're used to seeing. condition overload, adding attack speed, but of course my choice always has to be a little weird, so I have a habit of wanting only base attack speed and not Berserker Fury, even if it means I'm forced to roll the weirdest Riven you've ever seen. Now I wanted to include these super broken examples last for anyone that's thinking about them, but it should be obvious. Weapons that shoot a projectile like glaives, gunblades, or even Zaws with Exodia Contagion, I will always put melee influence on because they just go so well together. Nothing is more of an epiphany moment for my randomizer than putting this build on the Sarpa and having a jaw-dropping moment of seeing just how well these two mechanics work together. Also, you could put Exodia Contagion on every Zaw, but I had to use it sparingly, so I only put it on the Rabvi and the Dokram because they would otherwise just be a slam build. Now the nice thing is that this melee influence video is also a video about all the other melee weapons that don't use melee influence. 2 of the weapons with force slash procs on the heavy attack don't have that on any normal attacks. Those are Whips and Dual Nikana, while the other 11 have either one or many stances that also offer the force slash proc on normal attacks. Machetes are a unique example because that force slash proc is only on the forward blocking combo of Sundering Weave, which plays into why they don't fit the mold quite as well. Heavy scythes are also different because you only really use the Hespar this way, and that weapon is just a whole nother beast entirely. Also, two-handed Nikanas are almost in a league of their own. That heavy attack is so powerful compared to the normal attacks that it's the only example of a weapon that I've optimized purely for spamming Tennokai heavy attacks with Discipline's Merit and Melee Crescendo. But the other 8 weapons are pretty interchangeable in their usability. Warfans are another fun example because of Quasis and Aurum Spinosa having projectiles, but Gunson and Veracruz still follow the default pattern. Okay, that covers some of the strange examples, but that still leaves scythes, daggers, dual daggers, Nikanas, tonfas, rapiers, and claws in no particular order. All of these weapons I've mentioned have saved me more than a few times dealing with high value targets like Acolytes, Necromechs, and Thrax. The main hallmark of the build is actually adding viral damage. This may be heresy, but I don't really like having a viral primer weapon, so adding it in manually guarantees I'll be proccing at least a few stacks while being locked in with just that weapon. Another weird point is that I'm not using melee afflictions on weapons that would apply. That arcane adds 6 more stacks of the status effects on an enemy every time they're knocked down or flung, including the force slash procs. But there's one trade-off, and it's the reason I use melee animosity instead. Acolytes and Necromechs have a max status limit of 4, making that arcane literally useless against 2 of the high value targets I'm worried about. So my choice becomes melee animosity, which increases the crit chance of your heavy attack by 42% per hit. Instead of multiplying the number of status effects, I'm just increasing the damage of each force slash proc of the heavy attack. But melee animosity only works if you don't use Discipline's Merit, which is yet another example of me making builds that might have people raising eyebrows. Instead, I use Dreamer's Wrath, which is more expensive but adds a little bit of crit damage to heavy attacks while simply increasing the Tennokai chance. This will allow you to land more hits to build up animosity before Tennokai procs. On average, I still don't hit the max of 420, but I can pretty easily get over 300 if I wait just a little bit. And my final point for anyone that's thinking about it is that there are obviously examples of weapons that outclass these judgments. Weapons like Hate, Ceramic Dagger, Anku, and Okina are just a few examples of how an Incarnate's ability gives it so much power that influence makes more sense. Also, tenet weapons like Livia, or really any single target weapon with built-in electric damage like Prisma Oma, fit into the category of single target and influence builds, and are great candidates for Rivens to save mod slots. But that pretty much covers every melee weapon in the game. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy Warframe, or maybe the power of these builds makes you want to get back into it, I stream Monday through Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific time, so feel free to ask all the questions you want live.